about telling you a couple of family stories from the last couple of days. So my Helen and Ty and Sally and I all went to a movie on Friday night, and we enjoyed the movie, but the credits were Aretha Franklin. So I started jamming in my seat, because it's Aretha. Sally announces to the world, "Thank God I'm just adopted." But the other thing is from this morning. So, Pastor Mark had this sentence in the sermon. So I'm sitting next to my wife and we're paying attention to the sermon. Pastor Mark says, "A study published last year found that once a family reaches a certain combined household income of $25,000 in the United States, poor income tended to be associated with reduced life satisfaction and a lower level of well-being." And my wife says, "Per month." So I still, I can't stop working. We're not happy with it.
Where did you put that
I'll explain it to you in a second time.
That was not in the approved propaganda.
Well, she failed to reset the filter this morning.
It's going around.
Friday night, $8.
All right, so we are doing...
For New Year, ladies, you got to re-up.
We're doing the wedding at Cana today. At least, I hope I wasn't supposed to do all of chapter 2, just because I didn't. So I'm going to start by reading it, except I appear to have gone off with the reference. I'm going to add just a couple of things as I read it to help avoid some misunderstandings that tend to happen when you read it in English without the cultural background. So I'm just going to add just a couple of things when we read it. But we're going to do a lot of talking about the cultural background behind this, with the way this story would have impacted its first century Jewish readers. But also, when you read the Gospels, there's a challenge that we face when we read the Gospel accounts, and that is that nobody at the time the New Testament was written had any experience in writing or even reading novels. This stuff is written down, but it's still primarily an oral culture. And when you are a storyteller in an oral culture, you know all about how to put in the tone of voice and how to sort of act out the story. Novelists now know that when you are writing a story, you need to say, "He said" sarcastically, or he said with a wink, or that you need to put the body language into the narration so that the readers can tell what's going on, because that's a whole bunch of the message. There's a big difference between someone saying something seriously and someone saying it with their tongue in their cheek. It affects everybody around them quite differently, right? There isn't any of that in the New Testament. And so you have to think very carefully about what's going on, because you will read the story with a tone of voice. You will put one in there because you are certainly not going to read the story as if it went like this, right? The problem is, unless you're a professional actor, most of us are not trained to think about the body language and the tone of voice. So what we do is we just put in a default without thinking about it, and we're not even aware that we have chosen to interpret the story, because in our minds we're just reading it. So when you read gospel narratives, you actually need to put in quite a bit of effort to think in your mind about what's going on, what are the emotional dynamics, what's the tone of voice that people are using, how would you play it if you were supposed to act it out. And There's not necessarily a right answer because the Bible tends not to tell us. But at least if you think about it, and an example I've used with I've been trying to explain this to my kids for years, is that, so I have a really bad temper. And stupid people really annoy me. Because
Houston.
mostly it's because, I think of myself as really smart, and I really did when I was a teenager. I was very arrogant, and people I thought were stupid really annoyed me, which was, most of the world. So I had a great deal to learn. But Jesus spends a lot of time saying to his disciples things like, "Oh, ye of little faith," and "How can you not understand?" Right? And when I read that as a teenager, he read it when Jesus talked like this. How could you not understand? Right? Then I had kids. And I became the parent of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and they were always doing the most amazingly stupid things, and I would hear myself say, "What are you thinking?" Only I thought it was funny. I was having to try really hard not to laugh. Right? And I started discovering that Jesus talking to his disciples started sounding a whole lot different. Because I was a whole lot different. And without even thinking about it, I had been accusing Jesus of being as annoyed by the stupid disciples as I would have been annoyed by their stupidity. Right? And this is something that it's a really easy trap to fall into. So it's really easy to make cultural assumptions. It's really easy to make personality assumptions. And the wedding at Cana is actually a really good, it's a really good story to sort of practice on. Because there are some significant cultural differences, but also the dialogue between Jesus and his mother is a pretty problematic dialogue for a lot of us. So I'm going to read the passage, and then we're going to just go through cultural differences and all kinds of stuff. And I'm going to try to go really fast because I want to leave lots and lots of time at the end for you guys to talk amongst yourselves about all the ways in which you think I'm wrong. So let me find the passage here. So this is John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. On the third day after Jesus met Nathanael, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus had also been invited to the wedding and his disciples. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "There's no more wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour of suffering has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now, draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everybody serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have gotten drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." And Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there for a few days. So, if you were reading along, you probably noticed a couple of additions, and I will explain when we get there. So let's start with geography now. The next time I teach, I'm bringing a portable swing and putting it right here. Although we may try putting the food. I think the problem is that we put the food back there, and everybody gets food and sits down at the nearest seat. So everybody winds up sitting as far away from the screen as they can, and I think it's because the food is as far away from the screen as they can. So what we might try doing is putting the food up here. I think it may be as simple as that.
That would have been more interesting not to tell everybody and just. If everybody said it would have been a sociological
See, I just don't have the
experiment.
mind of a psychologically manipulative experimenter. So, this is Nazareth. This is Nazareth down here. This is what is, by a fairly wide margin, the most likely location of Cana of Galilee. That's about 9 miles. And 9 miles is about half a day's trip. Wearing sandals and walking on the kinds of roads that they had, 20 miles a day was about the limit. Okay? From there, Capernaum is about 10. So, this story takes place, Jesus' family has come down from Nazareth, and whenever you're reading in the New Testament, it talks about people going down someplace and up someplace. They didn't think in terms of maps. So down is not south and up is not north. Down is downhill and up is uphill. Okay? So Nazareth is up on a ridge here. Cana is just on the hill, just up above this valley, and Capernaum is all the way down to the sea. So then when you go down from Nazareth, you go down to Capernaum, then you make a hard right, down to Cana, and then you make a hard right and go down to Capernaum. And when you're ready to go to Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem. Okay? So that's the movement. Now Jesus and his disciples have come up from somewhere along the River Jordan, and we're not really sure where. All right? So Jesus and his disciples, his brand new, newly minted 4 or 5 disciples, have come up from here, and his family's gone down to there, and then they all go down here to where Peter had a house. So I don't know if they stayed in Peter's house, but they go to Capernaum and all hang out together for a few days. Okay? So, 3 things where there are big cultural differences. I'm carrying that around. Weddings, hospitality, and wine meant very different things to first century Jews than they do to us. Alright? So, the first thing to understand about weddings in any society that is not historically obscenely rich is that marriage is not about romance, it's about economics. If you were born before the 18th century, certainly before the 16th, your first concern was to not die before you were 3. Which, see, guys, there's no way you're going to be able to do this, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. Half children in the ancient world died before their 3rd birthday. If you were a woman who got pregnant in the time of Jesus, for any given pregnancy, you had a considerably less than 50% chance of seeing that child grow to adulthood. So the first order of business was just to survive your childhood. Assuming you survived your childhood, the second goal was don't starve to death. And the third goal was don't get murdered before you have time to starve to death. The ancient world was ridden with famine, with plague, and with violence. And your 4th goal was have somebody to take care of you when you're old and can't keep yourself from starving to death. These were the priorities. Marriage was meant to address those priorities. That is what it was about. Marriage was about producing kids and being able to take care of yourselves. The Greeks actually thought of romantic love as a sort of undesirable form of insanity. There's a story in Herodotus, I won't tell you the whole details of the story, but there's a story in Herodotus about a king who winds up getting himself killed. And Herodotus begins the story by saying there was a king in Asia Minor, and you can just hear the disbelief and contempt. who fell in love with his own wife. And that's why he died. You know, so the romantic love is not at all thought of highly. But the Hebrews had a much better, much clearer understanding. But even they thought of romantic love as something that you could hope to develop if your parents had chosen well for you and had raised you to be a person of good character. So they did value romantic love. There's the point in 1 Samuel where, I don't know if you remember, but Hannah, Samuel's mother, was barren. And what that pretty much meant was complete failure as a woman. Certainly as a wife. Because you couldn't survive in an agrarian society that required a great deal of physical labor. In a subsistence agrarian economy, a woman couldn't survive on her own without help from manual labor from men. If she didn't have a husband, she couldn't survive. If she didn't have kids, she wouldn't survive long once her husband died, which is why the Bible is full of a constant refrain of taking care of the widows and the orphans. Right? So Hannah was not having children, and her husband tells her, "Why are you so upset? Are you not worth more to me than many children?" And from the time of Samuel for the next 2,000 years, every Jewish wife who read that story said, "Why can't my husband be like that?" What a romantic, sweet thing. It's because it was an astonishing thing for a husband to say. So, romantic love, if it was there, that was great. They at least had better sense than the Greeks that they valued it. But that's not what marriage is about. So, the way this worked is, first of all, the families, not the kids, the families negotiated. Very common for two people to get married without having met each other until the wedding day. So it was a negotiation carried on primarily by the families. So the fathers negotiated the deal, but we all know that the mothers probably have a whole lot of influence. The fathers signed the contract, but they did sign a contract. When you got engaged, the contract was executed, and it was legally binding. And the attitude you can see in the Old Testament. A unmarried and unengaged girl who is seduced by a man, the man now has to marry her. An engaged girl, not married, an engaged girl who is seduced by a man is an adulteress, and the guy and the girl are both stoned. The important change of status happens at engagement. And terminating a Jewish engagement contract was a significantly bigger deal than terminating a modern American marriage.
It's fairly easy.
Yeah, it's not a high bar.
No, not cheap.
It's not cheap, but not
Not hard.
Yeah. Third step is the groom-to-be, now that there's a contract, goes to prepare a place for his wife, usually in his father's house, so that where he is, she might be also, and you might recognize that phrasing. This could take a while, because since this is an economic arrangement, he has to be prepared to economically take care of her. Once that is prepared, he doesn't actually have to tell her he's coming to get her. He could just show up. So Jesus showing up and saying, "Let's go," would be analogous to that. And Jesus talking about not being surprised when the bridegroom comes. You didn't actually have to tell her. You could show up at her dad's house after a year and say, "Now we leave." But that's not a good way to start, a lifetime living with people.
Was it always assumed that the father of the daughter would set up a contract in which the new husband would be more financially successful, or at least equal to what he was providing for the daughter?
No, not always. The bride price could be very significant. It's a straight economic negotiation. So And it is a negotiation, and these are Jewish negotiators, so it can be very intense, you know. I was curious to see whether I could get stoned for.
No, but you will be reported.
I will be reported to. It's a good thing I'm not a paid employee.
Yes. Past tense.
So usually you would provide warning, and there was a little bit of a safeguard built in that if the girl had never been married before, you could only show up on a Wednesday, and if she was a widow, you could only show up on a Thursday. So she only really had to be ready once a week. When the groom came and got her and took her home, then for the next about a week, the groom's family held a sort of open house. So the wedding lasted a week. You didn't have to have the same guests show up all week long necessarily, and this still happened. I have a friend who's Tunisian, and he went back home to get married to the girl literally next door, a marriage that had been arranged by their two families. That marriage lasted a week, and every night of that week, Samiha wore a different $400 rented dress, but he came from a pretty well-off family in Tunisia. So it's a week long, and it's pretty much an open house, and it's done by the groom's family. All right? So.
I know the Mormon culture still has, like, they call it open house.
Do we? I know nothing about it, so.
I just have friends, I have lots of friends who are Mormon, actually. And one of them's planning their open house right now, actually. And I never heard of that when I asked her what that was.
We're thinking of making a movie.
It's a coincidence that I have lots of Mormon.
Well, I think that, I'm pretty sure the Mormons think of themselves as the 10 lost tribes. So, for all I know, that was a deliberate imitation.
That's what sold me.
We can't go to the wedding, actually. No, they don't let you.
They
You're
don't
not
let you
allowed
in.
to the temple. That's, I think that's also part of like theirs.
We're going to set a little tent outside the temple.
It's actually quite interesting, like even actually the father of the bride is not allowed to go into the temple because he has had a major, he committed adultery and has not repented for that sin through the church, and so he's actually not allowed to be in the church with his daughter when she gets married in the temple. I mean, he knew that was coming, could have repented, but it's pretty, to me it's really fascinating.
Well, it's a good thing to take morality seriously, frankly. Hospitality is a big deal in the Middle East, has been for 2,000 years. I will give you the best example of that I can think of. So, Jesus has a couple of parables where he's talking about the importance of persisting in prayer. And Jesus likes to do the how much more thing, right? If you, being evil, won't give your children a snake when you ask for a fish, how much more will God? So his idea is you should keep being persistent in prayer. And one of the parables is the unjust judge. The other is from Luke 11:5-8. And what Jesus tells him in the parable is he says, suppose one of you has a friend who you go to him at midnight, you knock on his door, and you say, I have a friend who just showed up, and I got no food put in front of him. I need to borrow 3 loaves of bread. And the friend says, go away, I'm asleep, and the door's locked, and I don't want to deal with you. And then Jesus said, even if he won't give it to him as a friend, if you keep knocking, he'll give you the bread just to make it go away. Now, the point of the parable is that the moment Jesus gets to the part where the guy who's having someone bang on his door at midnight doesn't immediately leap up and say, let's get this done, everyone in the audience is like, what a jerk. Okay? And you'll notice, this poor guy, a friend of his, shows up at midnight without warning, and it is absolutely his moral duty to find some way to get food to the guy. So hospitality was a really, really big deal.
It wasn't Lot who was willing to give up his daughters as opposed to having his
Yeah.
guest manhandled, so to speak.
Yep, yes, and it's not the only story like that. So, and then we get to the cultural role of wine. Now, wine, we are used to clean water sources. Drinking water was a really good way to get sick until the 20th century. Unless you had a really strong immune system, which is one of the reasons that half of people died before they got 3 years old. So wine, unlike water, was typically safe to drink, but the Jewish association with wine is not primarily health. And most of us know about Paul telling Timothy, stop drinking only water, drink a little wine for your stomach's sake. Health was not the primary association Jews had with wine, it was joy. Wine was the preeminent symbol in Jewish culture of joy. I forgot to look up which verse, but there's a verse in Proverbs about wine that gladdens the heart of men. The rabbis actually had a saying, where there is no wine, there is no joy.
Are we talking red?
I didn't know he was practicing that.
I guess he only.
Well, actually, that's not every time you post that.
So, I was just about to say, and Crystal's raised the point already, they really did not like drunkenness, but they really liked wine. So
They like a good buzz.
So that really is essentially it. Without getting drunk, they could tell that even if you didn't have people getting drunk, if everybody had a glass of wine, the party got happier.
Still true, many thousand.
I'll tell you what, the only thing I'll say is it's a good thing that Ben picked this week to not be here, because not having a member of the pastoral staff in this room is probably a good thing to do.
There's a reason why there's a second Baptist church instead of the first Baptist. That was the main reason for the original story.
But wasn't the wine back then, I mean, it's not near the alcoholic content it is now.
So the wine was,
You just had to drink a lot more.
the wine was, I'll go ahead and say this point now. You beat me to it. So the wine was just as strong, but you mixed it. You
Cut it.
You cut it. The Greeks mixed their wine with seawater, which seems to be yes, that was their standard way to drink it. They mixed it with seawater. They thought of wine as a way to make seawater drinkable.
It's kind of like Coke with peanuts, you
It worked for 3,000 years.
Well, they had short lifespan. Maybe they would have, but they didn't. So, the combination of the importance of weddings, the importance of hospitality, the importance of wine was the rule number one at a wedding: don't run out. It was not a matter of mild embarrassment. It was a social catastrophe. It was an absolute failure of your responsibility, both as a party to the wedding contract and just simply as a host. Don't run out. There is reason to think that there were actually legal consequences, that you could be considered to be in breach of contract. So if you ran out, it was a big deal.
Was it also like something that their marriage would not be happy? Like it's just going to be a catastrophe from that point forward?
Well, yeah, if you couldn't manage the really
bad
simple
omen.
fundamental task of getting enough wine in advance for the wedding, your chances of being economically competent,
Right.
which was the whole point of getting here in the first place. Right? So, all right, so now some of the specific, that took too long. So, all right, so,
Way to go, Paul.
but we're having fun. So, pass the one. Question is, who is getting married? I'm going to go so fast here. All right. Jesus' entire family is invited to the wedding. It mentions that Jesus' mother was there. It says Jesus was invited. But you remember verse 18, Jesus and his mother and his brothers and the disciples all went down to hang out in Capernaum for a while. So, his whole family is invited to the wedding. It's not And it's a half a day's walk, so this is not just a casual drop on by. Now, Jesus is not the bridegroom, he's not the father of the bridegroom, and he's not the oldest surviving brother, of the bridegroom. So Jesus is not responsible for making sure they have enough wine, and neither is his mother. And we know that his mother wasn't, because she doesn't say we're out of wine, she says they're out of wine. Okay? However, Mary is intimate enough friends with the bridegroom's mother that she is one of the few people who finds out about what's happening before everybody else does. The people at the, so what's happening is you've got a bunch of wine stored back in the kitchen. And the guy who's sort of been appointed the wine master, he's a family friend or whatever, he's the guy who's responsible for making sure, your job is really to make sure that the rate of alcohol consumption is optimal. If people are getting drunk too fast, then the amount of water that gets mixed in the wine goes up, the number of toasts go down, so this is he's sort of a regulator of consumption. And when they need more wine at the table, he'll call for it. And what has happened is that the last jug of wine in the kitchen has been called for, and they're pretty sure more is going to be coming. So the guests have not yet found out that they're out of wine, but Mary already knows. So Mary has to be very close to the people who are responsible for the wedding. It is traditional that Mary was the groom's aunt. And that's probably as good a guess as any.
What if it was in hopes of Jesus doing something about it?
They don't. This is his first miracle.
Yeah,
I know,
So
but
there is no idea.
they have no idea that they have
He's
no idea.
only really revealed himself to the 4 disciples at that point,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. So, but that brings us to...
Sorry.
No, it's good. Well, actually, the third day, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. This just means he's doing a series of events, and he's being careful about the chronology. So there's the day that the Pharisees come, then the next day this happens, the next day this happens, the next day this happens, and the third day there's a wedding in Cana. So it's not the third day of the wedding, right? It's day 6 in the sequence. That's all. Now, why is Jesus' mother involved? Okay? So, there are a number of theories. One is that Jesus caused the problem because it is clear grammatically, it's not clear in the English translations, but it's clear grammatically in the Greek that Jesus was the one who got the invitation and his disciples tagged along. And it's also clear narratively. Jesus decides to go to Galilee because he's got a wedding to attend. And actually, do you know the one thing we know about Nathanael, other than the story? 15 chapters later, we find out that Nathanael was from Cana. And this is purely my guess, so it's probably wrong because somebody besides me would have thought of it. But it sure seems to me as though Jesus says to Philip, "Come follow me, I'm on my way to Cana, I've got a wedding to go to," and Philip says, "I know a guy from Cana. He's right here close. I want to go, let me go get him." And then Nathanael's response is, "Nazareth? What good comes out of Nazareth?" So Jesus has headed for Cana to go to this wedding. But the people at the wedding, they're expecting him, but they're not expecting him to bring, 4 grown men along with him, 4 or 5 grown men. So
That's why they ran out of wine.
there are people who really think that's the case, and I will not dig into it.
Paul, it's not
no time to
not
talk.
a lot of talk anymore, Paul.
It is a fun thing for you to play with. And it has a lot to do with how many people you think were invited to this wedding to begin with. If there were 500 guests, an extra 5, no. If there were 30 and an extra 5 guys show up, maybe so. All right?
Our wedding is very similar to something like that. That's why Rush and I are laughing back here. We had it, going back to Egypt for our wedding, we expected about 500 people at the wedding. We had over 650 according to the count. but there were a lot of people who we didn't know were invited or weren't. In fact, I know for a fact there was one couple who came and said, and these are our neighbors who came to.
And there was no Jesus there, so. Did Jesus turn water into wine?
This is very typical of Middle Eastern type what.
Because
Wow.
Because hospitality was a duty even to people you didn't know. If you saw a stranger in the marketplace, there was a moral duty to make sure they didn't stay out, right? So if people showed up, you had to feed them whether you planned for it or not.
No one has to be used.
There's a possibility that God had given Mary sort of prophetic knowledge that Jesus was now about to start doing miracles. I myself think it's more likely that for his first 30 years, even without doing miracles, Jesus had established himself as a guy who was really good at solving problems.
What was I saying? This is his public outing of miracle. What about anything privately in their family? He's
So-
not shown.
So
So she had an inkling of like, okay.
But wait a second, Mary happens to me. Mary had been told this is Jesus is going to save the world. And so she, I'll bet her whole life.
You don't have to rush it. You don't have to rush.
As a mother, how would you get
You guys don't talk about this, and I have to run.
Here, do something. Here, fix this. I mean, probably his whole life.
The disposal's broken, Jesus.
I was saying, you think Jesus fixing house repairs and miracles?
I'm going to finish my slide. Why is Jesus so rude to his mother?
He wasn't rude.
So the way I understood the passage growing up, right, is that Jesus said, what are you involving me for? It is not time for me to do miracles yet. Time has not come for me to start my ministry. That is wrong. Whenever Jesus says my hour, whenever the New Testament refers to Jesus, his hour, they mean one thing and one thing only, and that is the hour of the Passion. Jesus' hour is the time of his suffering and testing. I added time of his suffering because do you have a Bible that has the same thing? But the only other place where it in the New Testament where it talks about somebody's hour is when a woman is pregnant and her hour has come and the birth pains start. When that grammatical construction means my time of suffering. So whatever Jesus is saying, he is saying, whatever it means when I say, what is this to me and you? The reason that it doesn't mean anything to him and Mary is because it's not time for the crucifixion yet. And there are a number of possibilities. For example, what is it to you and me, could mean, why should we care? And that sounds like an SEP to me. You know what an SEP is? Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans? Anybody know what an SEP is? Is somebody else's problem to you? This is somebody else's problem. But a real possibility is you're worried about somebody running out of wine. Wait till you and I get to Calvary. What is this compared to what you and I are going to go through? The other possibility, I have my doubts about this one. I know of at least one commentator who argues in favor of this, but I haven't been able to find any other passages in Greek that would support this. But if you say, if somebody next to you, not naming any names, says, oh man, the Chiefs just scored a touchdown and now we're behind by 3 and there's only 4 minutes to go and Brady only has 3 timeouts, and you say, what's a field goal to Tom Brady? Right? So, and I have found a commentator who reads it this way, but I can't find any other supporting Greek texts that do. So I have my doubts. But it is at least possible to say, what's a little wine shortage to you and me? At any rate, whatever he says, Jesus' mother clearly interprets him as saying, I'm on it. Right? Because she immediately turns to the servants and says, do whatever he says.
So that adds
It
credence
could
to
be
the
like,
deal.
you can take care of kill me.
Also,
He's fundamentally saying, look, this is not important. Now, whether he's saying, this is so trivial and easy for me to handle, I got this, or whether he's saying, there's way worse than this to come, I don't know.
also, this is kind of a separation of him being a son to her, because he didn't say, Mom, what do you need? He's like, woman, what's this concern? Because he kind of like elevated himself and said, okay, this is different now.
To a certain extent,
Yeah.
it's not nearly as emphatic in
But he was
the
still
Greek
separating
language,
himself.
but there is a
being-
certain.
He's in charge, like,
All right, last thing. So, because this was the thing I really wanted to do, and I didn't. So I went to Home Depot to try to help you realize how much wine Jesus is making. So, somewhere between 18 and 27 gallons. I found something in the middle. This is 23 gallons. That would be one of the jars. I also went to see how much wine it takes for a wedding, according to the internet. If you have 100 Americans and they're only going to drink wine, and you're having a 6-hour wedding, you need about 30 gallons.
Great vision.
Paul's not there.
But remember, they cut their wine. So this is probably enough wine for 200 Jews for 6 hours, or if they're coming over every night,
Jewish leaders.
if they're coming over every night, 25 Jews for a week. Okay? That's how much. Home Depot only had 5 of these. I don't know what Home Depot thought about me taking all their things down. The last one had to be photoshopped, but that's how much wine Jesus made.
On the skew there.
Well, they didn't want to have to go to Lowe's.
So, that's how much you needed to keep 25 Jews happy for a week, and this is how much Jesus made at the end of the week when they were already out of wine, and the point is simply that he was not skimping, and the last point is nobody knew. Nobody knew. Because if people had found out, it would have defeated the whole purpose, right? The whole point was nobody in the village could know that the groom's family had run out of wine. So the only people who knew, even Jesus' brothers, almost certainly didn't know because they didn't believe in him yet. This sign convinced his disciples. It didn't convince his brothers, probably because his brothers didn't know any better than anybody else where the wine came from.
What about the servants?
The servants knew, the disciples knew, Jesus knew, probably his mother knew, but even that's not certain because it's entirely possible that she said, do whatever he tells you, and she went back to the party. And the wine showed up, and she was like, I knew he'd take care of it, but doesn't necessarily know how to do it.
And the servants would definitely want to go against their
Yeah, you know, well, if you went out and told people, oh, you know what happened, we're going to run, you never get out again. So, the point I wanted to make with that, and I'll let you go, and I'm terribly, terribly sorry for having kept you so long. How many times Jesus produced enough wine for literally hundreds of people. And maybe the biggest miracle is he kept people from finding out about it. He did it, and nobody even knew. So the question I was going to have you talk about, and you can talk about at home, how many times in our lives do you think that God does something that spectacular right under our noses, and we have no idea, and we don't notice? Because to me, this is the coolest thing about the wedding at Cana, is Jesus does this huge, spectacular thing, only he does it so quietly and so tactfully that nobody even knows it's a miracle. And you were supposed to have like 15 minutes to talk about that amongst yourselves, but instead, Paul, can you close us in prayer? Because you seem to want to talk today.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think my conversation took 20
No.
minutes longer.
I ran way too long in the first couple.
I take credit for 7 minutes. Okay. Father God, we just thank you for the message today and Kenny's teaching, Lord Jesus. We just ask you that each of us were able to draw out of it what you have for us to learn. Ask you to bless us as we go forward, and that we have a safe and productive week, and that all of our prayer requests will be addressed in that time. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.